everyone.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here with our next guest, Anand Giridharadas. And it is...
Should we acknowledge what they're all thinking about our matching suits?
Only...
Not coordinated.
So I think you know I'm the Lieutenant Governor of the state of California. But I am also someone who has been following Anand and his incredible work, and we're going to talk about his most recent book. But first, I thought I would just start, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to follow his work and his story, just with a little bit about you. You are the son of Indian immigrants. You grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. You went to Michigan, University of Michigan, and oh yeah,
wow,
all right.
Representation.
And then Oxford, and then Harvard. A very accomplished journalist, writing for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and now you have published your fourth book. You also, by the way, have this newsletter. What is it called?
The Ink.
The Ink.
The.ink.
Yeah, and you will post things and get millions of likes on your Instagram and sort of X and everything else. So I would say, certainly among our crowd, because I'm a little older than you and Anand, that you're very much centered in your work in for your age group in understanding this new paradigm of information and how networks work in the United States, but I even think beyond that. So the book that we are here to discuss is your fourth book, and it is called The Persuaders. And it is, it's a very, very interesting book, but I thought the way that we could start is by you telling everyone, you know, who are the Persuaders, in particular the actual individuals whose story you tell, and just as to give you an idea, the founder of the Black Lives Matter, well, at least the person who coined the phrase Black Lives Matters and has worked as an activist, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a close friend of yours, Bernie Sanders. So if you can, just for everyone here, start with the kind of zoom out. Who are these people who you're writing about? Why do you call them persuaders? And why did you write a book about them?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be in conversation with you. You know, the kind of books I write are not because I know something and want to share it. It's actually because I don't know something, and so then I spend a few years going to find people who do know the thing that I don't know. Maybe if I knew more, I'd be a fiction writer and would just tell you what I know. But I don't have that gift. So the thing I didn't know when I started The Persuaders, it felt like we had moved into a phase of American life in which it felt impossible to change anybody else's mind. It felt like we were too stubborn to change our own minds. And even more than things like polarization and these kind of words that you hear thrown around, it felt like we were becoming more and more fatalistic about each other. That person will never stop believing that. That person will never get the vaccine. That person who voted for Trump once will always be for Trump, so on and so forth. And it seemed to me that that's kind of the end of democracy. Democracy is a system where we argue, we talk, we haggle, and we then choose the future together through this kind of faith that maybe you'll change your mind or maybe I'll change mine and we'll figure it out. And once people stop believing in that, once this kind of what I call in the book the Great American Write-Off takes hold, it's all over. And so I went out in search of a bunch of people who I call the Persuaders, who were defying the odds, who were doing what most of us are not, who were pursuing persuasion in an age of polarization, who were pursuing the idea of never giving up on people, and who were trying to figure out how you actually do it in a time of incredible propaganda, of enormous right-wing disinformation machine abetted by foreign governments, in a time of very, very high stakes where things we value like democracy and the Constitution itself may be here today, gone tomorrow. And I tried to learn from people, educators, activists, organizers, elected politicians, and others, not who are like perfect experts in this, but who were themselves struggling with how do you do this? How do you stand for things and reach out? Because a lot of us these days are very good at standing for something and yelling our stance wherever we go. But a lot of us have gotten quite bad at actually bothering to reach anybody else and even caring about whether we're growing the ranks of people who believe the things we believe. And so this is a book, kind of an odyssey in search of people who were doing that. And I learned a ton from them.
What struck me is that they all have this in common, that they are out there against all odds, working to persuade people with varying degrees of success. But what they also have in common is that they are all, I think, could be defined as part of this sort of broad progressive movement in the United States. And so what also struck me, and I'm curious about, is in some ways they defy the odds and are able to make progress. But for instance, I think Black Lives Matters is a very good example of it. The Women's March, an extraordinary feat of organizing. Bernie Sanders, who for decades no one listened to him, and he started, this incredible movement and brought attention to things like student debt and healthcare inequities. But at the same time, there is this other reality you talk about, which is here are these people making progress on those issues, but then you have the greater Democratic Party, which by all accounts isn't able to persuade, I think, as effectively on issues of caring about democracy and democratic institutions, maybe as they should be. So can you break that down for us?
I think in many ways, the book is about an ascendant theory of persuasion that is replacing an older idea of persuasion that you really saw on the left, the Democratic Party in particular. And the old theory I would call persuasion by dilution, right? Which is the way you deal with trying to grow support is by watering down your ideas and hoping that that endears you to people in the middle, right? So maybe you start with, for example, a really vociferous defense of immigration, and this kind of border thing happens, and then you basically go to the middle, and you're like, okay, I'll close the border, but nicely. That's where Democrats have often ended up. Or, okay, healthcare for everybody, okay, that's too expensive. Okay, we'll do healthcare for some people, and you have to pay for it yourself, and insurance companies will be the main beneficiaries, but it's that kind of watering down, right? Or Bill Clinton, the era of big government is over. Remarkable thing for a Democrat to say, but that's what it looks like when Democrats have often felt a need to reach more people, ending welfare, as we know it, to reach more people by diluting, by starting with some big convictions, some ambitious dreams for the society, and then kind of cutting the limbs off of those dreams in the hope that that will woo people. What ends up happening in reality, as I think a lot of Democrats have learned over the years, is even when you moderate yourself and dilute yourself like that, and then you go to these, white areas, working class areas in Pennsylvania and places like this, and you now expect this wonderful, warm welcome because you've moderated your ideas for them, they still think you're a communist. They still think you're a communist, right? And now you've saddened and depressed the people who are most for you. And you're kind of left in the middle. If you were a Democrat saying the era of big government is over, you're not going to beat Republicans on the issue of people wanting less government, but you've now saddened people who really actually do depend on government to help make their lives better, which is actually all of us. And so there is a group of people who I'm writing about in this book, a new generation. This book is largely about a bunch of women organizers and activists who I think are waging a quiet, sometimes not quiet, insurgency against that notion that you persuade by, cutting the limbs off of your dreams. That in fact what you do, according to this new theory, and there's different variants of it, is essentially you actually stand for big, bold things that are inspiring to people, right? Ending big government as we know it, or these things are not closing the border, but humane. It makes no one feel anything, right? And so actually having big, bold stances on whatever issue, and then getting people on your side so fired up about those things that they are chatting to everybody within earshot about those things, right? And one of the phrases in the book that one of my characters says, you got to animate the base to persuade the middle. It's a completely different theory. You actually have to have a core group of people who cannot shut up about how cool the idea is, right? I think, to pick one issue where I think this dynamic has occurred, student debt relief, right? If that was happening in your life, and by the way, they've cut back on it, it hasn't gone, but for lots of people in the last few years, they were logging into a site and suddenly this burden that they'd borne for years was gone 1 minute to the next, or greatly reduced, right? Do you think those kids, young people, were talking about anything else at Thanksgiving? So now their center-right, small government libertarian uncle who doesn't like Biden but loves that kid is thinking a little bit, wow, I've never seen my niece so happy in 15 years. So when you actually have the big version of goals and commit to them, it then gives you a platform to reach out to people, not by saying defensively, I'll cut my ideas in half if you like me, but in fact, I'm offering something dramatic. I'm offering moonshots, right? But I want to create a kind of movement that has space to pull you into it. And if you're not with me on the moonshot, that's okay. You still have place in the movement. I'd like to talk to you about why. To me, it is a complete inversion of the calculus of the Democratic Party in recent years. And I think it's very exciting. And it's an insurgency that they've not necessarily won yet.
So I think it's also pretty clear, though you don't talk about the way, as much about the way that the right is able to have a movement. You have publicly talked about Trump and Trumpism, not Trump as an individual, but Trump as a movement. It does seem like that's a big part of the juxtaposition here, and I think that we're all very well aware of this notion that it feels like, Trumpism is like this runaway train, and Democrats are a bunch of candidates trying to explain why that's not good for you. So could you just share with everyone some of the things over the years as you have reported on and watched and engaged with the right? What is it that they do that has made their movement successful enough, for instance, to lead to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, something that by certain accounts 80% of Americans want, bodily autonomy for women, a woman's right to choose, and yet that, as a result of the politics of the right, has just been taken away. So you've noted how successful they are. How would you stack up what they do, and what lessons do you think that we can learn from that?
I think we have to be very real and clear-eyed and honest about it, as painful as it may be. The reality is, Donald Trump's Republican Party and the MAGA extremists, as dystopian as I find their vision, they have built an actual movement. An actual movement meaning many things. They physically meet. They have kind of a sense of transcendence in politics in these rallies. There are symbolism. There's hats. There's T-shirts. There's colors. There's ecstasy. not the drug, but the feeling. It's probably the drug also. There is, in this case, a kind of feverish and highly misguided devotion to a leader. But there's all the elements of some of the best and worst movements throughout history, right? And I think if we are honest, I don't think it's Republican and Democrat anymore. There's a pro-democracy movement in this country and an anti-democracy movement at this point. And the pro-democracy cause, I should say, in this country, I sincerely believe, does not have a movement. I would argue has not even really been attempting to build a movement. I meet so many people because I work a little bit on MSNBC. Who, they meet me and watching MSNBC. Yeah, I say, what show do you watch? They say, oh, I watch it all day. 4 or 5 hours a night. And I'm thinking, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be going and doing stuff. With no disrespect to my network. I think on the political left, a kind of consumption of outrage, consumption of like the media of outrage, an online reaction to it, or just stewing with your friends, has come to feel to many people like they are part of some cause or movement. They are not. And there is no movement. Movements have a physical presence. Movements are people who hang out together, not just talk about politics. They're just in your life. There's cookouts. There's just things happening in your neighborhood all the time, loosely or tightly affiliated with the larger political cause. Movements feed people. Movements do mutual aid stuff. Movements have songs, chants, anthems. Where is any of that? Can you blame Donald Trump for why there's no kind of animating pro-democracy song right now? Has he prevented us from having some song that moves people? For those of you old enough in the room to have lived through the 60s, how nested was your politics in so much else, in the culture, in the music you listened to, in the words you knew by heart, in the records you bought, in the festivals you went to? It was all a thing, right? And your support for civil rights or being against the war, it was all part of a culture. Does anybody alive think we have anything even closely resembling that today? We all claim we are so outraged by this assault on democracy. But is anybody even attempting to build this? Is this White House attempting to build the thing I'm describing? Is the DNC raise your hand if you've been asked for $5 via text message in the last month? 5 minutes. Okay, second question. Raise your hand. They have your info clearly. Raise your hand if you've been asked to go anywhere physically or do anything by those same emails. Look at the room for a second. They want you to text in $5 and stay home and keep watching MSNBC and staying mad. I don't know why they want this. It is puzzling. But I think we can't just whine about the fact that there's a dangerous movement over there when we have not gone to the mat trying to build a pro-democracy movement. So some of the elements of it, movements have stories that animate them. We often live in this wonky land of policies, policy names. People don't know what the reconciliation package, like regular people do not think about things like the reconciliation package, right? Even things like Medicare for all, right? People want freedom from illness, or people want actually to know what their life's going to feel like. But more than story, I think there's a question of, one of the things a lot of people in the book talk about is home. Movements offer a home, right? Like, you get a confusing medical bill. Is there someone related to this pro-democracy movement, the party, a private group? You get a confusing bill that you could go to in your neighborhood and be like, hey, I got a confusing medical bill from this insurance company. Is it a movement sufficiently organized that there'd be someone in your neighborhood? No. And then even if maybe you're a center-right person, but you don't like your medical bill, Edna on the 3rd floor from the Democratic Party or from whatever group helped you, and you kind of think, maybe those values are values that I've discounted. And finally, I would say the movement needs not only to be against the assault on democracy. No one is excited to reduce a harm. People may want to do it. I think we all want to not have assaults on democracy succeed. or most of us. I've met some people in the green room, I'm not sure. But I think people want to know, for what are we saving democracy? What are we going to do once it's saved? What's your life going to be like? It's not so exciting to just beat back a threat. What kind of healthcare would you like to have if we safeguard your freedom to choose your government? What kind of multiracial democracy will we be? And what will it feel like to be that country of many colors and many stories and many flavors if we beat back this kind of white nationalist upsurge? Our movement is, such as it is often telling a kind of defensive story that is on the terms of the extreme MAGA right. Instead of saying, here's our story of America, here's our patriotism, here's our story of trying to become truer and truer to our founding words every generation. Here's the kind of country we're going to build, and we want to invite you in, and you can come in at any stage on the ramp. We meet you where you are. Welcome. We don't have a movement like that, if we're being honest. I don't even think we're trying to build one, and I say this to you not to depress you, but to excite you. That means we can do it. And that means when these things are neck and neck in the polls, maybe they won't be neck and neck if we actually start showing up and building this kind of movement.
So, yeah.
All right, we got some early sign-ups for the movement.
That's all right. So I'm really interested, though, in digging a little bit deeper on this, because we recognize that Trumpism is mobilizing people, and that the Democratic Party's efforts is not. And while I think everything you said, if the only thing you're being asked for is to give $5, then where's the movement? But a lot of what they do is driven through social media too. A lot of those folks don't necessarily need to show up. So how do you think that the right is using the tools of how information is now disseminated, but also in disinformation? Because you do write about truthiness and truthism and disinformation, and you know quite a bit about Russian interference in the election in 2016. Do you think that's part of it as well, that they're just able to use those modern systems to distort and manipulate information better than us? And what do you do about that if you want to be the party that, while you want to have a movement, you also don't want to be brought down into the kind of things that we see the right's willing to do?
First of all, I think there is a real asymmetry in terms of in the physical world stuff. The right has evangelical church networks. It has, homeschooling networks. It has gun clubs, fishing clubs. There's a bunch of IRL hanging out for which there's really no counterpart on the left, and the left, I think, has become an extremely online movement, which is not really a movement. In terms of the online space, everybody's in the online space. I don't think it's like one side's in it and one side's not. I think the question is like, what is your strategy and what are you doing? And I think here I would like to raise the word emotion. And this is something that is very central to my analysis of politics and how I've written about the world. I don't think people experience politics, these kind of questions we're all talking about, through their experience of the actual thing. Like, I don't think people are sitting there thinking like, what is the optimal border policy that I should support? Like, people don't know, if we're honest, right? Experts don't know often. I don't think people are sitting there thinking like, is it really Medicare for all, or would a private? People don't know. The way in which people actually process politics, in my experience, is emotional, which is how we process everything. But I think a lot of people who work on the kind of well-intentioned side in politics don't realize this and kind of think it's about the policies and it's about the data and the economy's good. Why are the people not happy? The crime data suggests things are safe. Why are the people feeling afraid? And I think we have to take seriously that authoritarians, aspiring autocrats, fascist movements, historically, around the world, you were in Hungary, across from Viktor Orban, the bad guys understand emotion very well. And it's people actually on the pro-democracy side who are stuck in this fantasy of reasoning, data crunching voters. And they don't understand what's actually going on. So what I think is going on in America, if you just step back, I think we are living, and this is a more optimistic way to tell the story, I think we have lived through an era, and you are in my lifetimes of everyone in this room, of remarkable head-spinning progress. And first of all, we never tell the story like that. Let's just, we have changed more, for older women in this room, right? More has changed in the status of women in your lifetime than in, all of your lineage of women going up maybe forever. More has changed in your single lifetime.
Yeah.
Think about that. When is the last time you heard the movements that achieved this take some credit for it? It's a remarkable thing, right? No matter where you come from, pretty much, those places were terrible to women.
Can I just, as an aside, I was driving to the dinner last night, and I was with one of my members of my staff, and for some reason we were talking about the antique shops and in Palm Springs, and she said, oh, I feel like I should have been born in the 1920s. I love the fashion of the 20s. and she said, LG, do you have an era that you feel like you would have wanted to lived in? And I said, Janine, if I had been born in any other era, I wouldn't be doing any of the things in my life that I'm doing today. How could I possibly be wistful of some other era? Because it just, none of it would be possible.
So that's women. That's
Right.
half of people, right? Then you got people of color, black people, other people of color, children, immigrants. We opened up immigration in 1965 to non-white countries. We did that progress in the lifetime of people in this room.
Yeah.
Right? We transformed the economy many times over. That was necessarily not as good. Good in some ways, not as good in other ways. We opened up trade with China, which completely transformed the landscape of this country in ways people did not anticipate. A whole bunch of jobs went away. We're dealing with the climate transformation, a whole bunch of jobs that people do, sources of esteem and belonging, here today, gone tomorrow, or need to be gone tomorrow to save the planet. We have lived through a lot. We're living through, if you're a white person in this country, I can bet you didn't think about being white until pretty recently. And now, there's books, you're thinking about it, you're grappling with it, maybe you're on this side, but you're aware of race in ways that no one talked about when I was growing up in Shaker Heights, Ohio in the 1980s. So we are living through an era of remarkable change and often remarkable progress that we don't tell the story of. And any kind of change like that throughout history causes big feelings. This is normal. It used to be okay as a man to behave like Don Draper, and it is now no longer okay. That's a giant change. It's a very positive change. But let's not pretend that it's an easy, just because change is correct doesn't mean it's easy for people, right? And so I think we've done.
So bring that down, break that down, because you were talking actually last night about this. What does it mean to someone who was essentially protected by the system if now they're going to have to compete differently?
In every way, I think about this a lot, that just because changes are correct for all of us as a whole, it doesn't mean they're easy for individuals migrating from one way of life to another. Every man in this room who's not 17 years old has lived through a pretty fundamental change, thankfully, in what it means to be a man, what your sources of esteem are, what you can do, what you cannot do, what your competitive place in the market is, everything. Mm-hmm. I would argue, as a feminist, all these are excellent changes. But before we judge them, they're just a lot. They're a lot. And we've, a bunch of men have made this migration very successfully. I would gather a high fraction of men in this room are people who've done okay in that transformation, who figured out who they are on the other side of change. And we all know a very large number of men in this country have not yet made that transition successfully. We know through history, like, eventually people will. It's just hard. It's hard to, like, figure out, it's hard to move houses, let alone move conceptions of being a man. Same on race. Right? If you grew up in a small town, white town, never met anybody else, Chasten was talking about growing up in Traverse City today, and then you're suddenly in a different world, or new people are coming into your town, you're not like a racist or an evil person to feel unprepared for the new world that's coming. Or people when the
And so isn't that then part of the success of Trumpism?
Correct.
That it's building on people's fears and insecurities. It's a backlash to all of the positive
So
change
they
that
understand, the authoritarian movements understand that eras like ours produce big feelings. And they get in there. The big feelings themselves are not right-wing ideology. They're just feelings. Anxiety, future dread. Am I okay? And they get in there quickly, and they organize those feelings through their kind of media funnel, radicalization, and they take you from just feeling a little bit uncomfortable or not knowing if you're good or gonna be good. They take you from there into there. And basically, the pro-democracy movement does not have a kind of corresponding thing. So when you come home as a parent, or your kid comes home from school, which is happening to all of us these days with kids in school, and saying, hey, is America a bad country? You know, because they're 6 and they're losing the nuance of what a teacher might have actually said. That parent may have the resources to say, well, it's complicated here, but that parent may also feel attacked. Or that parent may feel, you know, it's kind of embarrassing to have your kids knowing and understanding things that you don't know and understand. Your kid's getting an exposure, that you, right? And may resent that child. And so then that doesn't become an anti-CRT movement in 2 seconds. The right brings you from that moment at 4:30 p.m. with apples and snack and milk, brings you from that into slowly this kind of rage about CRT. It names your anxiety and puts a thing on it, and it doesn't matter that it's fake. So we need counter movements that walk with you into a different story. It would be great for an older white man like Joe Biden to tell a counter story in a way that no one else can, in a way that Barack Obama couldn't. Say, hey, look, here's the reason. Here's the reason you're going to some of these workshops at work that sometimes seem annoying. I get it. I didn't grow up with that stuff either. They didn't have that in Scranton in 1926. But here's why we're doing it. We're doing it because we want the brightest voices. We never want a woman's idea not to be heard just because she's a woman. We never want a black person's idea not to be, and you don't want that either, and that, right? But someone's got to tell us this story. Otherwise, the only people explaining your fears to you are the authoritarians.
So can we go back? This may be dangerous territory, but I want
unlike the rest of them.
I want to just understand a little bit more about the tension between the progressives in the Democratic Party, which most certainly are able to build excitement and momentum. You know, we saw this with AOC, we certainly with Bernie Sanders, with Elizabeth Warren, and those who feel like some of the positions that they advocate for, let's just say it's democratic socialism, that they say, well, how can I be part of that? Or how can I welcome them in if it's not just about like going to the middle for political reasons, but I actually just don't share those policy positions. You know, how do you grapple with that?
I think I think of this book as like a loving intervention with people who I want to succeed, right? And I think it's in a way 2 different interventions, and you named it well. There's a progressive wing of the Democratic Party and a more moderate wing. And I think they each have a fundamental sin in this era, and I'm trying to address both. I think the moderate sin is failing to be ambitious enough about actually changing people's lives, right? The moderates have let themselves clip their wings, trim their sails, and therefore not show people that democracy can make your life better. And that is one enormous source of erosion for democracy, because people who lived through 2008 or Katrina or COVID and just felt like, y'all are lecturing me about democracy being amazing and how I have to vote, but I voted and like, you didn't make my life better time and again, particularly young people, they're not wrong. And so I think, you know, historically and in recent decades, the kind of sin of the moderate wing of the party has been just like not recognizing that real material change in people's lives is the best advertisement for democracy. And by the way, I would draw a distinction between old Joe Biden prior to the presidency and Joe Biden in the presidency. I think he learned the lesson, and he abandoned that moderate sin in many ways, right? He was someone who very much was that kind of moderate. He got in there and he proposed 3 separate trillion-dollar-plus things, and he was educated by the moment, by the movement, by a lot of what progressives had been advocating, and he, I think, did a good job of integrating the coalition. I think the progressive sin, on the other hand, they're good at the ambitious goals. The progressive sin is kind of not being expansionary, not meeting people where they are, not giving a kind of welcoming vibe to people.
Okay, and I want to just pepper this with one story. Yeah. When the Dobbs decision was about to come down, we were on a Zoom call with women leaders getting ready to do like a press conference on the Capitol steps up in Sacramento. And there were leaders from Planned Parenthood on the call, from NARAL, which has a new name now, and they told us that we should avoid using the word woman. And instead, we should use the word Californians or pregnant people. Because that was inclusive of those who might be able to give birth, but who do not identify as a woman, and who want to have an abortion. So this is, I think, fair to say, a very small group. But not to minimize, you know, and just to say, you know, the trans community has been marginalized. They're a very, very vulnerable group. You know, I'm not at all interested in leaving them out of the conversation. But for all of human history, we've thought of those who have babies as being binarily female. And now is this moment where this massively important, utterly basic fundamental right, so hard fought to control the decision of whether or not to have a child, and it's been taken away, but we can't use the word woman. So everyone's blinking like in disbelief on this call, and I spoke up and I said, well, you say avoid. So if we avoid it, but we still use it, that's okay. Yeah. And I said, okay, well then I'm going to say women and all people should have these fundamental rights. You know, so in my own way, thinking, okay, how can I be inclusive, but not allow for the undermining of the best argument we have, which is hard-fought women's rights. So thank you.
I think it's a great point.
So it is real. When we talk about some of these kind of, you know, standards that are being set by the progressive movement that the rest of us are trying to kind of grapple with, I think that we do have to figure out how to come to terms with a lot of that, because, you know, what happens on the right is they pick up on this stuff and then they just hammer us with it.
I think what I take from that, I think it's a very perfect story, because everybody's a little bit right in this story, okay? Like, they're not being foolish. The foolish part is saying, don't say the word woman. That's the error. What they're trying to do is make sure that there's some people in the room, in the community, who don't feel degraded that day, and that's a real thing, And that's a really great impulse. What I object to when I say it's not an expansionary movement is, why do you have to not say women? What you did, your formula, women and all great, easy, obvious, additive, not subtractive, right? Like a bigger party, not boundaries and rules, right? I think we've often created movements that feel really judgy to people, and we need movements for progress to be like a party that everybody is like dying to get into, not a kind of nightclub that feels like hard to enter, right? With bouncers and like, do you know all the right terms and do you know, and so I think about a lot, how do you build movements that are really for something, big things, but inviting.
Okay, but isn't this then the contradiction? Because you're saying in order to be a movement, you shouldn't cut the limbs off and try to move to the middle, but at the same time, you have to find ways to welcome more people. How do you do both?
The difference is, do you appeal to people by not believing in anything, or do you appeal to people by believing exactly what you believe, but welcoming newcomers at any stage in their journeys? And there's actually a difference between these things, right? You can say, this movement is unapologetically for single-payer healthcare for everyone. No one in this country should ever have a medical bill again. However, if you're not there yet, there's room for you in the movement. We'd love to hear your ideas. It's a way of bringing people in through affect rather than cutting your ideas in half. And I think the reason it's so important is, we have to use a word we haven't used yet today, the movement for democracy in this country has to be, in addition to being an important movement and a movement that is righteous, it has to be a movement of joy. And we are at risk of forgetting that we're doing all of this. We care about all of this. These things matter, not because we want to sit and watch election returns and Steve Cornett. Like, it's actually because we want a certain kind of society, a certain kind of life. And I mean, I know we have to end, but I think there's this notion of, let's remember that the kind of country we are trying to achieve, you and I talked about this offstage a moment ago about California, it's an awesome project, the United States of America. We actually don't hear this enough on the left. It is
an awesome country.
It is starting with the founding ideals. I was talking with noted historian John Meacham about this last night, right? Sure, the Declaration of Independence said all men and didn't say women and was very bad to black people. But the notion in 1776 that there was just natural human equality was such a break from the past, it spun people's heads around at the time. And no one who wrote it was brave enough to live it at the time. We've gotten closer and closer and closer. Every generation in this country, there has been a choice between kind of more generosity and more miserliness. Bigger we, smaller we. Unless we get depressed about these anti-democratic movements, let's look at the record. When there was that contest in the 19th century about slavery, who won? Who won the contest between a bigger we and a smaller we, right? When it was the end of the 19th century, we got factories, industrial poverty, people on the street in these cities.
Yeah.
Who won the contest between do we take care of these workers and not, right? 1920s, women want suffrage. Who wins the contest between doubling the we and keeping the we small, right? The New Deal happens. Do we have unions? Do we protect workers? Do we put fire escapes on the tenement buildings after the shirtwaist factory fire? Do we have old age insurance? The bigger we won again. We had school integration fight in the 1950s. The bigger we won. When you had questions about gay rights starting, when you had questions about do we protect people from dirty air and dirty water, the desire to have more people thrive won again. So when you say it like this, you almost start to feel bad for the far right. It actually has not been a good couple of centuries. They do very well in these short-run battles, but again and again they have lost the fight between kind of generosity and closeness between a bigger we and a smaller we. And so I think, honestly, my 2024 advice is we have to buck up and remember the thing we're trying to build. Remember that we're trying to build an awesome kind of country that has never been built in history, a country made of the world, made of people from every other country on this planet, a country, I think, worth defending, worth fighting for, and get that buck up energy and build a movement that can win this future.
Bravo. Everyone, Anand Giridharadas, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And the book is The Persuaders.